So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin.
All right, welcome back to It's Just ADHD. Today we have a very special guest with us. Tara, do you want to do the introductions?
Yeah, so this is the most excited I've ever been for an episode. We have Dr. Amy Arnsten with us, and I'll give a quick intro for her. Dr. Amy Arnsten is a neuroscientist at Yale and an international expert on the prefrontal cortex and the molecular mechanisms behind healthy and disordered higher cognition, which is essentially an umbrella term for some of the more complex things a human brain can do, like abstract thought, strategic problem solving, or even having a sense of self. She runs her very own lab, which is aptly titled the Arnsten Lab, which studies molecular influences on the higher cognitive functions that take place in the prefrontal cortex. They have the overarching goal of developing rational treatments for cognitive disorders and mental illness. The lab is unique in its multidisciplinary approach to understanding working memory at both the cellular and behavioral levels. Her lab has a long and successful track record, and Dr. Arnsten has won numerous awards for her groundbreaking work. She was also featured in the HBO documentary One Nation Under Stress. Among other things, the Arnsten Lab discovered a process in the prefrontal cortex called dynamic network connectivity, which we're going to be discussing more in depth in a moment here. The lab has also made significant advancements in our understanding of multiple illnesses in the prefrontal cortex, including Alzheimer's, and most importantly, they have successfully translated these learnings into medications for treating various conditions that impact the prefrontal cortex, including medications for PTSD, long COVID, and of course, ADHD. So if you're like me and you take guanfacine to help manage your ADHD and like the emotional dysregulation that goes along with it, you have Dr. Arnsten to thank for this absolutely life-changing medication. So thank you for being here today and on this podcast on behalf of the entire ADHD community. Thank you for the work that you do, and please do not ever stop.
Absolutely. Dr. Arnsten, we're so grateful for you to be with us today. Yeah, to be a guest today.
Yes.
Please tell NIH this so that we can keep getting funded, because it is actually incredibly challenging time. Science is really
Jeez.
under threat. It's terrible. And I just meta comment a distraction. Cats love being the center of attention. They see the camera, they know where we're paying attention, and there they are. Yes.
Yeah, his little butt is hitting my mic around, which is not so great for a podcast. Well, shall we jump right in? I think one of the critical things here is, what is the prefrontal cortex?
Great question. And it is a perfect starting place for this conversation, because it's one of our most recently evolved brain areas, most recently involved even cortical areas. And as you started to mention in the introduction, it's critical for generating abstract thought in humans' language, working memory, and especially relevant to ADHD, it's key for top-down control. So control of our attention, our actions, and our emotions, what we often call the executive functions. It allows us to plan and organize for the future, make thoughtful decisions, be able to resist immediate rewards, and instead wait patiently for that bigger reward, the marshmallow test, as it was often called. And then it's especially important, the right hemisphere, helping us inhibit inappropriate responses. So inappropriate motor impulse actions, for example, being able to stay in our seat, inhibiting distractions, whether they're external or internal thoughts, and inappropriate emotions like aggression towards your teacher, the policeman. You might be feeling that, but we are not going to express it. And so really important for appropriate social behavior. So what we've been learning is that these recently evolved circuits have very specialized molecular needs to be able to perform these really remarkable functions, but they also have these very powerful mechanisms to rapidly take prefrontal offline, like during threat or when we're sick. And this makes these circuits so vulnerable to dysfunction because we've got this built-in mechanism to weaken the connections, which I know we'll get into, but it's remarkable that it can function at all so well so much of the time.
And let's get right into it. So you're referring to dynamic network connectivity, right?
Yes, that's the fancy term we gave for it. And it's because it can happen so quickly that we called it dynamic. And that prefrontal is part of both local networks and networks with other parts of brain that allow it to do its functions. In particular, prefrontal neurons excite each other to keep information in mind, to keep goals in mind, to have this top-down control. And so the strength of all these connections determines how strong our prefrontal abilities are. And what we've discovered is there's these very powerful mechanisms that can very rapidly either strengthen or weaken these connections. And strengthening them, for example, when we're feeling safe, interested, this would be important for us to know, so we're then stronger, or to rapidly weaken when we're under threat. So an example I give that I think has a lot of survival value in modern day is you're driving along the highway thinking, what am I going to do this afternoon? How am I going to write this piece? Being very thoughtful. And suddenly you're cut off by a truck. And you have to really rapidly take prefrontal offline, stop thinking like that. Your amygdala, striatum, sensory motor cortices all instantly have to come into play. And this habit you've learned from years of driving, slam on the brakes as fast as you can. So switching from thoughtful prefrontal to these more primitive circuits saves your life. If what you're having to do instead, if the threat is, oh my gosh, I have to give a talk in front of 1,000 people, and prefrontal goes offline and your mind is blank, not helpful. And I have had that happen. Another example of why having these rapid changes or relatively rapid. I know when I get sick, I feel really stupid. Even before I have full symptoms is like, I cannot write. And this idea that prefrontal function with all this intensive connectivity is very energy intensive. And when you're sick, your immune system is what needs that energy. So it wants to shut off prefrontal so it can have the energy to then make us well. And that is really important when we're sick, but you can imagine with prolonged inflammatory disorders where there's no longer a virus, but we just keep doing that can get us in real trouble. So this idea that in general, we're trying to coordinate our cognitive state with our arousal state, with events in the environment or things that have invaded our bodies like viruses, and have our prefrontal in an appropriate state to maximize our survival, but not necessarily our survival when we're in front of an audience of 1,000.
That makes sense. So we'd actually talked about your papers on the show before, and maybe you can double check my understanding here. But I think of it as like literally highways, right? And if you have structural issues, your highways might have fewer lanes, but dynamic network connectivity is almost like doing road work where you close a couple of the lanes. They're not going away forever, but they're temporarily going away. Is that an accurate way to think about it at a 10,000-foot view?
That's a really fun way to think about it. If those workmen could run up within a second and stop everything and then run back again very rapidly. Because it took as long to take your prefrontal offline as it takes them to set up all the cones and whatever. When you were cut off by that truck, you would not be putting your foot on the brakes.
The world's most efficient construction work.
Yes, but very much that idea of, yes, this is not it takes a very long time to make a structural change, to make a new pathway or erode and eat away a pathway. And dynamic network connectivity is able to work so quickly because what it does is simply open or close potassium channels near the connections. When potassium channels open, it weakens the connection. It's like, nope, you can't talk to this cell. And when they close, it strengthens it. And that can happen within milliseconds. And so that makes the process very dynamic indeed. And without having to build or take away connections.
Yeah, this is yeah, super fascinating, and it sounds really powerful, right? Like it sounds like a lot of this are survival mechanisms, right? Allowing us just get through day-to-day life, and where it feels like it gets off is whenever that survival mechanism is sort of like misplaced. And so where to your point, like when we're just in front of an audience, whether it's 1,000 or just giving a presentation
Yeah.
for a
So,
team.
there's a lot of work now that shows how stress impairs prefrontal function. We were really the first to discover that an acute, even quite mild stressor will cause prefrontal dysfunction. But the key variable is whether the subject feels in control of the stress or not. So it can be a huge challenge talking in front of 50,000 people. But if you're confident about it, hey, this is fun, you're fine. It can be talking in front of 3 people. If you're feeling threatened, that then prefrontal goes offline. So it's how you experience it. And we've seen this in animal studies and in human studies, that a sense of control is the critical variable. And why confidence, why training, why support, all those things can really make such a difference. So why people who are involved in dangerous jobs have so much boot camp also, so that they develop the habits, so that if their prefrontal is going offline, their striatum knows just what to do. That's the right habit to fall back on. Yeah. So, in the military, you see that fire drills, things where you don't have to think about it when you're in danger. Your subcortical structures know what to do.
Is it fair to say that the prefrontal cortex goes offline more often and under sort of less duress with ADHD compared to someone that's neurotypical?
I don't think actually that's necessarily true. And, there's probably many things that are the actual underlying causes of ADHD. I've met many people who have ADHD who are actually in emergency medical fields. They're fantastic at it because they are bored normally and antsy. And it's when, an emergency is like having a stimulant, and they are like paramedics who do fantastic things, and yet, go get very bored under normal conditions. I do think that if it was something they weren't, in general, if you we're kind of jumping ahead here, but if you have things that have weakened your prefrontal, you may be less able to deal with a stressor that you do feel threatened by, because those are, a paramedic is, of course, deeply trained to deal with that. And so that would be part of why they'd be doing it so well.
Makes sense. So I guess getting into the cause of ADHD, obviously we can answer that in one sentence, super easy, right? But you tend to hear a number of prevailing theories. So you hear that it's caused by low dopamine or norepinephrine, which I know you have said on other podcasts is not quite accurate. So I'd love for you to correct that. You also hear about these structural differences like delayed development of prefrontal cortex or weaker connections to other parts of the brain. And then, of course, dynamic network connectivity is another factor. So can you kind of talk us through the interplay of the chemical, the structural, and the functional differences that are kind of all interconnected to create an ADHD brain?
Yeah, there's many things that can lead to weakness. And of course, people originally jumped on, oh, it must be too little norepinephrine and especially too little dopamine because stimulants are increasing. And so that's normalizing. And so the genetics then said, it's a lot more complicated than that. There is a little bit of risk that you can relate to dopamine, but so much of it is probably related to developmental factors, ability of neurons to connect. There's extensive work out of the NIH showing that in typical development, the right hemisphere enlarges. So the right inferior prefrontal cortex is especially important for response inhibition, for being able to say, don't do that, don't attend to that. And in a typically developing child, the left side starts out bigger, and then as you go from age 4 to 20, the right side grows much larger. And this is what we all call maturity, right? Being able to sit in your chair or whatever like that. And what this group showed was that in those with ADHD, that right enlargement was either happening more slowly or not at all. And I think they showed about half the population they were studying, it was just slower and it would catch up. In others, it stayed smaller. In general, this idea of having less prefrontal actual gray matter there, so fewer connections, therefore less connectivity with other brain areas, that especially shows itself when you're doing a prefrontal task, something that requires response inhibition or regulation of attention, or as we were just showing in the Washington Post this week, they talked about a new subtype of ADHD that was about impaired emotional regulation, and prefrontal regulates emotion too. So it's just how much of that is affected gives you the variety of what you have. And I wanted to emphasize that, before the information age, when we have to sit in front of our computers for hours, the genetic factors that cause ADHD were probably selected for, that it can be a great advantage in many cultural situations. And so it's probably just recently, when we have to sit still for long periods of time, that this is now being harmful to success within our particular culture. That having to run through the woods and be distracted by any little thing would save not only your life, but your whole community's life often, right? And that kind of cognitive spectrum you could see useful to our society even until very recently. So to see it in that context rather than as this is a bad thing.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot, because like the way you diagnose ADHD or autism is only ever like relative to your situation, right? Like I was reading a book and they're talking about an autistic kid in their room alone has no visible signs, right? Like they're on their own plane.
Well, it depends how severe the autism is.
Sure. Yeah. That's
Because,
absolutely true.
you can have a kid alone who's rocking and banging their head against the wall.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking in this case probably lower support needs. But to the point of like when you have to sit in front of a computer and it's like relative to your peers and in an environment where society expects or a certain portion of your day expects a certain thing out of you, and then that you go home and like your life is completely upside down or different, right? That's where those things are going to get in the way and prevent you from succeeding or growing or communicating, right? Into your point, like in any earlier era, like I think about my grandmother, the genetic component. She grew up on a farm, right? I don't think I don't think she never had any diagnosis of anything. She would never have had to, right? It just didn't appear until until like and my dad got missed. But then it's like, so where did I get my ADHD from? Did my grandmother have it? But looking at like her life on a farm, it's like, oh, yeah, it would have looked totally different in that era.
It would have looked really helpful.
Right.
Yeah, no, this is why we love you, Amy, because a lot of the time on our podcast, we do talk about some of these studies, especially on the autism side, that take a strictly deficit-based model, sometimes egregiously so. And so I appreciate that you kind of look at both sides of the issue.
Yeah, no, and especially, you know, how ADHD being distracted can also lead to creativity, out of the box thoughts. Helpful to have somebody who then can organize and get your taxes in. But there are definitely benefits associated. Yeah.
I suppose on that note, would you want to briefly talk about default mode network?
So, the brain imagers have given all these names to these networks that are activated in this very artificial situation of somebody lying in an MRI.
Fair enough.
So I've already gotten in a lot of trouble with my comments about this. And default one is the one that I get in the most trouble about, because when we name things, we're really limiting them and really, I will say in this case, tainting how we think about them. And the so-called default network is also those cortical areas most needed for our highest order metacognitive, self-reflective, imaginative. And so to call it default, is when we know some of those same areas are the ones that are critical for some of our highest order capabilities. So yes, I've already gotten a lot of trouble about that one. And I also think, we very much see that how connectivity shifts when different tasks are happening even within the scanner. And so the interplay of different areas, I don't like to think about. I know it simplifies to talk about networks, but I think it also limits very much how we think about brain networks and how they relate to our cognitive and other abilities.
Thought I asked, you're out here myth busting today. For our listeners, if you haven't heard of it, default mode network, there's kind of this concept that neurotypicals are only creative when they are able to sort of be calm in a shower. Otherwise, they are in a task-driven mindset and they are binary. Whereas with ADHD, the default mode network, which drives creativity, is on all the time. But it sounds like that's probably kind of an oversimplification of how it works. So
I very much think so. Yeah. I mean, there's seeds of truth, of course, always, right? So there's evidence that when you're engaged in a task that requires prefrontal, and if it's visual spatial, as it often is in an MRI scanner, parietal as well, that then shuts off the default mode network, but that a lot of create happens with dorsolateral prefrontal very much engaged, for example. And a lot of so the the brain imaging field often talks about default mode as daydreaming, because that's often what you're doing when you're just lying there at rest and trying not to listen to this thing banging around you.
makes sense.
But
It's a very contrived situation.
yes, and I also think it's unfair to the prefrontal parietal one. I think these things are always changing their connections based on the moment to moment demands of our lives. The point you made about being creative in the shower, though, I really relate to that. And this is directly related to the dynamic network connectivity that I have found in my own life, that if I'm under pressure to come up with a creative solution to something that's very challenging and stressful, mine goes blank. I cannot do it. And we think this is actually due to too much dopamine D1 actually gating out the network connections you need to solve this complex task. And so in a shower, hot shower, not a cold one, and going for a walk in the woods, when you relax and stop the pressure on yourself, dopamine levels come down and norepinephrine alpha 2. Norepinephrine comes down, so engaging alpha 2A. and allows networks to connect and allows you to have creative solutions. So I think that process is very much related to dynamic network connectivity, and that when we're stressed and pressured, how hard it is to be able to think outside the box.
I'm so glad I asked. I've not heard that on anywhere else before. Everybody kind of just talks about dynamic network connectivity on all these other podcasts and stuff. So thank you for explaining that.
Well, I had no idea. I've tried to put dynamic network connectivity on Wikipedia, and they tell me it already exists. The term dynamic functional connectivity, which is the term used by people who do human brain imaging, but that's a correlation between areas activated, whereas we're really talking about what I'm guessing underlies that. And so I'm trying to trick Wikipedia into letting we came up with it first, so we should be allowed to have it on there. Yeah.
We need more truth and factuality in this world. Well, so taking a step back, I'm just looking at the brain again, there was one longitudinal study that showed 31% of autistic women and 17% of autistic men will receive a psychiatric misdiagnosis before correctly being diagnosed with autism. And it's a very similar problem with ADHD. You'll be misdiagnosed with things like personality disorders, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, bipolar, when in fact and certainly there's a level of comorbidity there, but for many people that's just a flat out wrong misdiagnosis before the correct diagnosis of ADHD and autism. So from a neurological perspective, can you explain why some of these conditions have overlapping presentations at times?
Yes. And so there's 2 points here, the misdiagnosis and then the combined diagnoses. So the misdiagnosis, I think, is because there's so many things that can cause prefrontal dysfunction. And physicians also, I think, get very little training in this. There's almost nothing on prefrontal on medical schools unless you went to Yale, and I've made you listen to it. So people are just, when they hear impaired attention, they say ADHD. And very often, as from just what we've already talked about, if you're someone who's under a lot of stress and feeling out of control with it, you would have some of those same symptoms, right? Um, Give you a stimulant and it makes you worse. Yeah, especially, so you're feeling anxious and can't concentrate, can't sit still. And they say, well, you have an anxiety disorder and ADHD, not realizing that the anxiety itself may be causing the prefrontal dysfunction. And so giving somebody a benzodiazepine and a stimulant, and that would make everybody much worse. Really, the thoughtfulness needed to get at what's the underlying cause. And this, certainly with autism, it's so much more challenging because autism spectrum is now used to describe an enormous number of conditions. I think a lot of this is because it allows people access to resources. So in school, you can't get extra resources unless you have a diagnosis. And having a diagnosis of autism where there's so much help and there's so many groups online, et cetera. So you get to be part of a big tent where there's a lot of people who want to help. So that's great. And I think it's why there's such a huge increase in the number of people diagnosed with such, but it also makes things much harder because it runs the gamut of somebody who has no language, very little cognitive ability, somebody who would be like sitting in a room banging their head, maybe not even understanding what was being said to them, all the way up to somebody who's incredibly brilliant, high functioning, but doesn't like dealing with people, so and amidst all of that, you have prefrontal dysfunction. So many of the social cognitive networks are prefrontal. And so they are often some of the networks that are being affected by genetic mutations, for example. with, for example, altered numbers of connections, whether it's too many or too few. And so once again, somebody could say, well, they have autism and ADHD. Yeah. The second part of that is when prefrontal is being affected in so many disorders, it's not surprising that the circuits that create ADHD symptoms are also then if you have a nearby circuit, for example, with the emotional dysregulation, or another circuit that is normally going down to the striatum and helping to control Tourette's like tics. And if that's weaker, a small tic now becomes a much larger problem, for example. So it makes sense to me there'd be many comorbidities because prefrontal is involved with so many different things.
It's sort of mentally cut this question for time, but you're just really piquing my interest. So it sounds like number one, you think that probably ADHD and autism will 10, 15, 20 years from now get split out into multiple diagnoses. But I'd also love to hear your thoughts on, is part of the issue here like disciplinary siloing and like medical siloing where they're looking at it from one angle and not taking a multidisciplinary approach like your lab?
Well, the siloing has a good intention that and you can see this, they're trying to do this right now with depression, with things like ALS or frontotemporal dementia. If you can find what is causing this set of symptoms in this person, personalized medicine, what treatment would be best? So for some of these disorders like frontotemporal dementia or ALS, there's an actual genetic mutation now. Can we go in and correct that? So a goal of really trying to get at what's the underlying cause and how can we best treat it, I think is really wonderful. So that's siloing, but with good intentions in mind. And it takes a lot of deeper knowledge to be able to do that wisely in a way that will be helpful.
Do you think that they have kind of drawn these classifications incorrectly?
It's definitely right now everything's incorrect because not that was known and, trying to push things into DSM, whatever version. You can see that us trying to have a big bucket so everybody gets resources from the school is the exact opposite of what a physician would need, whereas what precisely is causing this so I know how to treat it, right? So ideally you're able to have both.
Yeah, to that point, it's crazy. Like just thinking about a lot of with autism, a lot of comorbidities come out like chronic pain, and you have like it comes out in the body in a lot of ways. When you go to a doctor, it's like if they're just treating chronic pain in one way and then missing the autism part, or if you're getting treatment for like ADHD and autism symptoms, but they're missing like all these other manifestations, it's like it's not a complete picture, and you're missing so much of the cause of the other thing, right?
And it's, the brain is immensely complex. And so much of the key information is missing, to be fair to everybody. So, for example, environmental insults during pregnancy that we have no idea have happened, even a period of hypoxia while somebody's sick, eating something that you thought was really healthy, but it actually had something else in it, that was exposed to radiation on a trip to Japan. And so you have a couple of small changes that, it's just, you can go on and on thinking of all the things that can happen that would end up just having small or large changes in brain development that we can never look back on and say, oh, yeah, it was that plane flight I took to Tokyo, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're having to deal with so many unknowns, such complex processes. So we have to be kind to ourselves about this.
So I know that some component of it is obviously a large component of it is strictly hereditary. Some of it is for some people de novo mutations. But do you think the future of diagnosis is going to look more genetic?
Certainly geneticists have hoped with that. And getting to see so many developmental related genes associated with ADHD suggests that's, I don't know if the word is fruitful, that the intuition is correct, but then how do you also, now you have a fully formed brain in adolescent or child or whatever. So what do you do to optimize what you have there? And also, I think the genetics is so complex and so there are a few, usually severe disorders, where there's a single mutation where we've come to see its impact. But most of the time, it's going to be, maybe even hundreds of genes of small effect coming together to have relatively subtle effects. ADHD is actually really subtle compared to the kind of devastating things that can occur with a lot of other mutations.
Well, so to talk about a more serious one, ADHD and Parkinson's are both associated with lower dopamine, similar parts of the brain. How do they differ, and why don't we use Parkinson's medication like L-Dopa to treat ADHD?
They're actually extraordinarily different. So Parkinson's is a progressive degenerative disorder of great seriousness. And the dopamine part of it is what is most evident. But it's really just one part of it. And restoring dopamine doesn't stop the disease, sadly. Yeah. Um, so the dopamine connection there um, is, I think, kind of a loose association. And also, most people with ADHD are able to, their dopamine systems are not degenerating. They're able to make their own dopamine. That's why stimulants are so effective in enhancing the effect. Whereas a stimulant doesn't help somebody with Parkinson's because the dopamine terminals have degenerated, right? So it's kicking a dead horse. My read on the literature is L-Dopa doesn't do very much for people with ADHD. Part of that is stimulants are having a lot of their effect through norepinephrine. Actually, Parkinson's is affecting norepinephrine as well too. So, but to be honest about that, but in Parkinson's, those dopamine and noradrenergic cells are degenerating, and that's not happening in ADHD. Thank goodness.
So to kind of summarize that a little bit, is that because stimulants are essentially blocking reuptake so that you're able to use the dopamine and norepinephrine, whereas L-Dopa is essentially giving you a synthetic version of dopamine, but it wouldn't matter if you're reuptaking it too rapidly anyway? Is that accurate?
So L-Dopa is actually not a synthetic version. What L-Dopa is the precursor for dopamine. And it's just that dopamine itself doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so what uh, they have to give L-Dopa, and it gets taken up into dopamine terminals and turned into dopamine and released. And that's why L-Dopa stops working as Parkinson's continues. And it's really tragic, and why they're now trying to, there's a dopamine D1 agonist that mimics dopamine that hopefully the FDA will approve soon, that might allow more continued ability to move, whatever, in Parkinson's. I would have thought L-Dopa would have done a little bit more in ADHD, but apparently from the clinical trials, it's less effective. And whether that's if you're already making a lot of dopamine, having more L-Dopa around is really not, doing much.
Well, it sounds like from what you're saying, it might be an access issue, right? It's like we have it, but trouble accessing it. That's where a stimulant comes in to like help get access to it. Is that?
I think for most people with ADHD, their dopamine system's really normal.
Yeah.
There'd be a few where there's dopamine related genetic alterations, but it's that a certain amount, a low amount of increased catecholamines helps strengthen prefrontal connections. If you have too much, then you've mimicked the stress response and you've actually made it worse. So that's why it's so important that therapeutic dosing is low. And if you go too high, certainly the doses people do to abuse stimulants, that's totally taking prefrontal offline. That kind of where they're doing it to get high. So this narrow inverted U, but the working theory is that for many people, stimulants are helping ADHD by strengthening prefrontal connections and helping the caudate to make use of that information in habits.
So essentially, the stimulants are a means to an end so that those pathways get used more and therefore get strengthened over time.
No, they get strengthened in the moment. So
In the moment. Okay.
they are with dynamic network connectivity. We've shown dopamine and norepinephrine are needed for strong connections. But it's modest levels. If it's high levels when you feel under threat, then it weakens. And with norepinephrine, we're lucky that different receptors get used for strengthening versus weakening. So for strengthening connections, it's the alpha 2A receptor. For weakening, it's the alpha 1 and beta 1 receptor. And that's why we can really use drugs that mimic norepinephrine to strengthen connections with, let's say, guanfacine.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking of alpha 2A, can you explain what guanfacine does?
Yeah, I brought us right into that. So norepinephrine has much higher affinity. That means it binds to the alpha 2A receptor than the alpha 1 or beta. So under conditions where we feel alert, interested, but safe, we get little bursts of norepinephrine to interesting events. Engaging our alpha 2A receptors are on the dendritic spines where prefrontal connections are made, and they strengthen connections. They close those potassium channels and allow our prefrontal neurons to excite each other, to help keep information in mind, help us do top-down control of action, attention, emotion. When we're under stress, we get really high levels of norepinephrine release. Our noradrenergic cells just fire like crazy. That engages the alpha 1 and beta receptors, and they open those potassium channels and boom, disconnect prefrontal networks and take prefrontal offline very quickly. That's why alpha 1 and beta antagonists are used to treat PTSD. So prazosin and propranolol are alpha 1 beta blockers that are used to treat people with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And actually, there are a number of studies that show that people with ADHD and autism are more predisposed to developing PTSD. Do you understand what's happening in the brain to cause that?
I think so. Prefrontal areas are really important for top-down control of emotion. To be able to say, let's say after a trauma, okay, we're safe now. I know that's reminding you of the trauma, but we are safe. Or don't think about that traumatic event right now. You're needing to focus on your spouse who's saying something important to you. So all this top-down guidance and leading, letting us tell ourselves we're safe. These are higher prefrontal functions that actually go from especially left dorsolateral prefrontal frontal pole to medial prefrontal to something called the subgenual cingulate, which activates our whole stress and visceral response and the amygdala partnering with that. So if you have less prefrontal connections, you're going to be less able to be your own cheerleader and help yourself through that. It's why they've also very much shown people with traumatic brain injury that impairs prefrontal are more vulnerable to PTSD. And you can imagine that happens a lot in the military if you've had like a blast injury.
So it sounds like the medication for PTSD and guanfacine, both of which you worked on, they're not the same channels, but they're acting similarly. Is that accurate?
So they have some things in common and some things that are different. Yes.
Nothing with the brain is simple, huh?
No, so an alpha 1 or beta blocker will um, should help, and we see sometimes does help under stressful conditions, but under non-stress conditions, not necessarily. Whereas the alpha 2A helps with either stress or non-stress, which is why it's much more useful for ADHD because it's strengthening prefrontal connections even under normal conditions. Yeah.
And do you know the long-term effects of taking guanfacine like over a number of years?
So there haven't been, as you could imagine, a study like that would cost many billions. So no, and guanfacine's totally generic, right? So no one's going to do that study. I myself have been taking it for 13 years now. I take a low dose because guanfacine also helps strengthen connections from due to aging and inflammation. So I've been taking a low dose for 13 years. You can ask my husband if I'm actually worse. Yeah.
I've been taking it for probably 4 years now, and it has transformed my working memory, like truly it has changed my life. I think it's so cool. I know it probably sounds mundane to people, but like I can hear my hotel room once and remember it the whole trip. Or like I don't lose things anymore. My rejection sensitivity is like 80% better because I'm able to sort of talk myself down logically, which you can't do before. So you can pry the guanfacine out of my cold dead hands. I plan to take it forever.
I've got to get on this. I've got to get on this guanfacine bag. I am so sensitive. Yeah, this like rejection sensitivity is just like the bane of my existence.
That is so yeah, it's something prefrontal being able to say, this isn't personal. This is this person. They're insecure and they're saying this, whatever. You're a good, that whole cheerleading perspective frontal bulb. Yeah. No, it's, I was forgetting where I parked my car, which was similar to the hotel room. And I always remembered, again, just one time, all right, I'm on the 14th floor, and then who stole my car? So, it's like, okay, because prefrontal functions weaken starting in middle age in humans and monkeys. So I was like, you believe the data, Amy? Start taking books.
It's like little tiny superpowers. Like no one else cares, but to you, it's incredible.
Yeah. But it's like, I better never forget where I parked my car again.
So guanfacine and clonidine are fairly similar medications, serve similar purposes. How do they differ?
Great question. So there are 3 types of alpha 2 receptors. Of course, as you said, biology is about being as intricate and complicated as possible. So there's the A, B, and C. And the alpha 2A receptor is the one in prefrontal that strengthens connections. And guanfacine has the highest affinity for that and low affinity for the B and C. Clonidine has really high affinity for all 3 of those. And what we think is happening is the alpha 2B receptor is very dense in a part of the brain called the thalamus that is very powerful for putting us in a sleep or waking state. And the alpha 2B seems to be very sedating. So there's another drug called dexmedetomidine that's actually so sedating, it's used as a co-anesthetic. And it has really high affinity for alpha 2B. That's its main receptor. So clonidine is got a lot of actions at alpha 2A, but it also has alpha 2B, which makes it very sedating. And it also has actions at what's called an imidazoline receptor, which makes it very hypotensive. So it has really pronounced side effects, but it comes on really fast. So if you have someone in an emergency situation, so I hear about like children who are hospitalized because they're being so out of control and aggressive and hurting themselves and others. Clonidine in that setting is often used because it works so powerfully and rapidly. But in school setting, you'd have somebody probably who's falling asleep where you'd be worrying about their blood pressure, fainting and falling. So guanfacine's much safer, and it also has a better half-life, things like that. So it's more useful for real life.
So I know this is a bit of a problem for schizophrenia medication, but when you have a medication that targets a particular receptor, if that receptor exists in multiple parts of the brain, will it target it in every part of the brain, or is there a way to sort of localize the effect?
At this point in time, sadly, it's everywhere, and that's the basis of side effects. So it's where luck comes in. You can know exactly what receptor is in charge causing some problem. Let's say also, well, if it's in the heart, we now can sometimes give peripheral blockers that do the opposite to protect. So that's, for example, the new drug for treating schizophrenia that's a muscarinic M1 agonist. They give at the same time an antagonist that doesn't get in the brain but blocks the peripheral effects, which are like intense nausea and things like that. But it's going to get the whole brain. And it will be wonderful if someday we can have it more targeted, but we don't have the technology for that now.
Yeah. And for our listeners, if you aren't aware, and let me know if I'm summarizing this wrong, but essentially schizophrenia, in certain dopaminergic pathways, there's too much dopamine, and in others, there's too little. And so they kind of have to pick a direction. And so they lower the dopamine, but it lowers it everywhere. And so in the regions where it's already low and you're taking it even lower, you get pretty severe side effects. So it's a tricky condition to treat.
That it is certainly a tricky condition, and it's what they're often doing is blocking dopamine D2 receptors, and there's too much dopamine in the caudate, which is that subcortical region that connects closely with prefrontal that's involved with cognition. When you have too much dopamine there, it magnifies hallucinations and delusions. My read on it is that in early stages of schizophrenia, the prefrontal also has too much dopamine and then it burns out and you have too little. So there's evidence that you get increased dopamine innervation of prefrontal in adolescence. And to me, that explains the greater stress response in teenagers and why somebody who's brilliant and thoughtful suddenly is acting really stupid because now dopamine has taken prefrontal offline. Yeah.
Does that mean if they were able to detect it earlier before they had essentially burned out those pathways, that they could do an effective intervention or a better intervention?
Yes, but I think for more important reasons than dopamine, that there's extensive loss of dendrites in schizophrenia, especially in prefrontal. And yes, being able to rescue those connections would be really important. And I've actually asked people, could they test guanfacine during the prodrome because these are teenagers and we know guanfacine's safe for that age. Could that strengthen these prefrontal connections and prevent them from being eaten away as occurs as people descend into the illness?
And do you mind briefly explaining dendritic spines?
Sure. So neurons are very much like trees, where they have a cell body where the tree grows out of it. And where if you picture the twigs and leaves are the dendritic spines, the little things sticking out that then go and meet other neurons. So in a tree, it's meeting sunlight and air. In a neuron, it's meeting an action terminal from another neuron. And many of the neurons we've been talking about today are excitatory, so they excite each other on these protrusions. And it's a way to increase surface area to get more connections. So these remarkable prefrontal neurons can have like 10,000 connections on a single dendritic tree. Yeah. So, or on a single neuron. So extensive connections, and they're really beautiful.
And essentially with certain disorders like PTSD, you see a die-off of the dendritic spines. Yeah.
With chronic stress, these are like studies in rats. You see the spines and then eventually dendrites atrophy. But in the rat studies, at least with time spent unstressed, they can regrow. That's the hope. And guanfacine protects against that dendritic atrophy in those models. It also protects against loss of dendrites and spines from hypoxia in rat models. So the hope is it does the same in humans, and that's why it's now being given to people with traumatic brain injury.
I'd love to ask about talking to a doctor about guanfacine, because like medication is so heavily regulated, and I've had such a hard time just getting even like the right stimulant medication consistently. So like, I'd just love to know, from your perspective, like any tips or thoughts on like how to have this start the conversation, what the conversation could be like talking to a doctor about getting access to guanfacine.
So I think it really depends where you live, because in many parts of the world, guanfacine isn't, especially if there's a national health system, it's absurd, but they don't even have it as a possibility. So at the same time that they're saying you shouldn't take stimulants because of the addictive potential, they don't have guanfacine available. So that's absurd. In the United States, it's very much available, but again, aren't educated about this. And so all they know often is a stimulant, but they've also been told, oh, you shouldn't prescribe it because there's such abuse potential and it's a bad thing. And so dealing with that kind of ignorance. There's so many papers out there that show that it's safe and effective and can be combined with a stimulant. So in some child psychiatrists who are experts in ADHD would say it's the gold standard, that the side effects of guanfacine and stimulants counteract each other. So the sedation and the overactivity with some of the eating stuff, and the therapeutic effects may even be additive. So one expert that I know of says what he does is he finds the dose of stimulant that's best and then adds guanfacine. And the idea that you can have even an immediate release during the day and then the guanfacine for 24 hours so that you can sleep at night, so you have control in the morning and trying to organize yourself for the morning. That has, in terms of time course, also round the clock best control. Everybody's different though, so I get to hear some people like Tara where this was the answer, that this was what their brain was needing, and other people were like, all it did was make my blood pressure go to the floor. So I think this is where ultimately it'd be wonderful to have personalized medicine where we'd be able to say, oh, for your genotype, this would really be ideal. As it is now, we just have to try it. But there are certainly very reputable placebo-controlled trials out there that can justify its use.
I wanted to briefly point out, you had mentioned over email that guanfacine is also an incredibly cheap medication to produce. And so in the countries with personalized or with socialized medicine that are also not prescribing guanfacine, it's not a monetary barrier.
No, it's generic. So
That's wild.
So it is really ignorance.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the barrier, or like what are the steps that we would need to take to get more personalized medicine? What's holding us back there?
The vast complexity of genetics and brain development and brain function.
Fair enough.
But there are a group out of Stanford that's doing this for depression, and they have found 6 different, if I remember correctly, biotypes of depression with different functional brain connectivity patterns that respond to different kinds of treatment. So some that respond well to SSRIs and others. One, the cognitive biotype responds to guanfacine is how I know about it, where it's people who have weaker top-down control of emotion, and strengthening it with guanfacine is an antidepressant for that subgroup, whereas SSRIs don't do much to help them. So if we can come to have that kind of understanding of, given this brain connectivity pattern, given your genotype, it seems like this medication would be best, but we're a long way from there.
So it sounds like it's fair to say that ADHD and autism are both highly polygenic conditions, meaning tons of different genes contribute to the presentation. Both conditions also have a lot of physical comorbidities like POTS, hypermobility, mast cell activation. Is it fair to maybe assume that they might also be pleiotropic?
So, a couple of things with that. You can imagine that if you have insults that have affected prefrontal, right next to that is our motor cortex, our premotor. So, if the same insults affecting those circuits, you could have fine motor problems, for example. Conversely, if you have an inflammatory condition, something where you either are having too strong inflammatory response or you have something that is continuously driving inflammation. We're doing a lot of studies now showing inflammation impairs prefrontal. I said early on, we have all these mechanisms to take prefrontal offline when we're sick. And so if you have inflammation, even now there's no virus, you're impairing prefrontal and can produce, that can be symptoms that look like ADD in particular, impaired attention without the hyperactivity, and often in the context of fatigue, for example. So many things impairing prefrontal, it's not surprising. And again, so guanfacine's being used to treat long COVID here at Yale in combination with something called N-acetylcysteine, which helps protect mitochondria and is also reduces some forms of inflammation. So as we have more tools, pharmacological or otherwise, to try and deal with these things.
And guanfacine can also be helpful for hyperadrenergic POTS, which is common with ADHD and autism as well. I had seen some people sort of hypothesize that long COVID might be a manifestation of mast cell activation. Do you agree with that? Because for context, I had seen some of your most recent research was on guanfacine for long COVID.
Yes, so I think there's probably, again, multiple things that can cause long COVID. We've
It's
been
never one thing. That's been the theme of today.
uh yeah, if it was one thing, we'd have solved it, right? It's also just trying to be respectful of complexity that too often, especially as scientists speak to the media, or media misinterpret a scientific paper in trying to communicate it, oversimplifying it so it sounds like this is it. And then people are like, well, then how come it didn't help me? So I think it's really important that we're honest about the complexity and why it's so hard. But then what a relief it is when we can help, right? And we can understand. So with one of the things we're focusing on with long COVID is something called kynurenine inflammatory signaling. And this is one of the things our immune system and our brain does in response to inflammation is we take tryptophan, and instead of making it into serotonin, we make it into kynurenine. And then kynurenine can get turned into something called kynurenic acid, which blocks NMDA receptors. And those are the receptors prefrontal circuits need to talk to each other. And so suddenly prefrontal circuits can't talk to each other. And so the N-acetylcysteine stops the production of that kynurenic acid. And so we think that's part of what's helpful. And guanfacine and alpha 2A receptors are anti-inflammatory, and they make the immune system cells, the microglia and macrophages, quiet down so they won't produce as many inflammatory substances. This is part of why dexmedetomidine is as a co-anesthetic, because in addition to making people sleepy, it's anti-inflammatory, so your brain doesn't blow up. It's also analgesic because there's alpha 2 receptors in your spinal cord that can help shut off pain.
I think one of my sort of final questions for you is I'm actually working on a documentary right now where I'm going around the world and interviewing mostly women and non-binary folks with ADHD to kind of talk through their experiences. And one of the common threads I've noticed, especially outside the United States, is really a skepticism towards medications overall. Like, I see a lot of common threads in Central America in particular where they'll think that because their diet is better, less pesticides and stuff, the ADHD will just go away, kind of not accounting for like lifestyle changes and stuff as well. So first of all, I just want to point out, when people are doing medication research, it's people like Amy. It's not necessarily always these like evil mega corps. There's nuance there, but not every medication is a conspiracy. But what would you say to people who are just generally skeptical towards medication?
Yeah, and there's also a whole culture skeptical about ADHD
Absolutely.
itself.
There are several countries that think that it's a conspiracy from American pharmaceuticals to sell drugs abroad,
Yeah,
even though
I've
it's been
also
researched for a century.
yeah, I've noticed that a lot of those countries, like Italy, are places where the cultures actually celebrate what we would call symptoms of ADHD. So of course they're going to say this isn't a disorder. This is us. So that gets back to the original part of our conversation. Do you live in a culture where having a brain that works like that is helpful or harmful to what you want to do in your life? And, if you're an artist in Italy, um, and it doesn't matter that you're at this appointment at exactly such and such and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. I'm sure that, you're probably having a really happy life. For those of us who are living in cultures that are very demanding of prefrontal resources. And that I want to say for many of us, that means a huge amount. It makes our lives meaningful. So even if it doesn't look as fun, it really is deeply rewarding. Having prefrontal deficits can really interfere with that. I mean, it's why I take guanfacine. I need to be able to digest, integrate, and focus on all this information to be able to try and make sense of the brain. And so, um, in for people in such cultures who have such goals, um, it is worthwhile to do what we can to get our brains in the right state. And I would say anybody who drinks coffee or tea is a hypocrite if they say medications, blah, 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 because caffeine is as powerful as a stimulant medication.
Now that you point that out, some of the countries that I had in my mind are some of the biggest coffee cultures in the world. So,
Exactly. It is, such
Propaganda.
yeah. So caffeine enhances acetylcholine, which enhances prefrontal function. It's just because it's not a prescription. Uh, we can get into this. Oh, it's good because it comes from a plant, and of course that's bullshit because poisons come from plants. So the that doesn't make something good or bad. What makes something good is it puts your brain in a state that's most helpful to you. And so many of these medications are now generic and cheap. And, it really does cost billions to develop them. I think people don't realize the years and years it takes to find, you start with thousands of compounds and you finally find the one that's safe and effective. And then you have to test it in so many people against placebo. And for medications for kids, huge numbers of extra things you have to do for safety, which is absolutely as it should be. So it costs a huge amount. And that's why when things are not generic, they cost so much to try and get the money back. I should say I've gotten to meet with in pharma people who are really earnest and doing it. For example, one woman whose kids all had very severe ADHD and went to work for a company that specialized in ADHD drugs to make a difference. And she was wondering, she was really doing it from good-heartedness. And then you have assholes who are charging a fortune for insulin. So there is that spectrum, but I think the majority of people I've met have very good intentions and are often doing it because they know they love somebody who's suffering. That's really the goal.
I know I said it was my last question, but I take, in addition to guanfacine, I take one called Jornay. It's a stimulant. It's only at this point available in the US. It was released in like 2018, and then very recently Canada and Mexico, not approved anywhere else. And it's still methylphenidate, but it is a super, super time slow release capsule that you take before bed, and then it's absorbed in the colon 8 hours later. And it's remarkably smooth. It is so much better, in my opinion, for at least for my body, compared to Concerta or any of the other traditional sort of slow release methylphenidate. But I found most doctors have never heard of it before, certainly outside the US, but even in the US, most have never heard of it. And it's been 8 years.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a lot of doctors have not heard of guanfacine either. What's the gap? Why is this happening?
So I think what has happened is there is such an overwhelm of information that medical schools have actually gone backwards in terms of what they can teach. And then you're thrown into internship and residency for specialized education. But there, you're so busy taking care of patients that you're really not learning as much. And who's there to train you is people who went to medical school 20 years before them. And it used to be drug companies would have these special dinners where they would teach physicians about new meds and lure them with, roast beef dinner. And that was made illegal. And so there's really, it wasn't replaced by anything.
Wow.
It's funny because you tend to think of that as a bad thing, like, oh, my doctors are prescribing this because they had financial incentive. But now that you're explaining it that way, there were very much unintended consequences because then the doctors are not learning about new medication.
Exactly.
That makes total sense. Okay.
Yeah, because go learn about it at meetings, but the same thing is they're not allowed to do, so it used to be they'd be like, when guanfacine was first launched, there was a breakfast where people could come and, okay, it's bacon and eggs and some muffins, and they'd get to hear me talk for half an hour and then a physician talk, whatever. Yeah. And so, when those things can't happen, you watch television and learn about it at the same time as your patient. So it's much harder, the avenues for learning, not only about what's available, but also what are the new discoveries in the field, period. This explosion of information. So many physicians don't even know the word prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, I had seen a statistic that 93% of psychiatrists don't receive a single day of training on adult ADHD, and it is also not on the certification exams. But yet they're meant to diagnose and prescribe.
Yes. Yeah. So it's, we have such a huge amount of information. How do we learn it? And don't say AI.
God, no.
Yeah.
It has to be a human that can know enough to also judge what's wrong.
We don't need sycophantic
AI
doctors.
makes such loose associations with such false confidence. It doesn't have a frontal pole. So the frontal pole card is, am I right? I think I was just wrong about that. And that's not something AI seems able to have.
Yeah. Well, I want to wrap us up for time. Thank you so much, Dr. Arnsten. You've been so generous with us today. Thank you for answering our questions. Thank you for being on the show and just helping. A big part of what we do is try to dispel misinformation and provide people with resources. So it's been great having you on the show and being able to to speak to everything you've been able to speak to. And thank you so much for all your contributions to science and research and medication.
Yeah, this
Thank
has been,
you.
I've been looking forward to this for months. I can't tell you how exciting this has been. So thank you so much. I've learned so much from you. And thank you for all of your work. You're truly changing so many, like, countless lives. And to all our listeners, for goodness sake, spread the word. Like, her work deserves to be recognized. And we do want doctors to understand that there are these additional options out there. So, talk to your doctor about it. Help educate. We can be part of the solution if the bacon and egg dinners are not happening anymore.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.